Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. Today we are going to be replacing the front brake pads and rotors on a Acura Mdx. This will be the same, if not similar, to the 07-2013 Acura Mdx and the 2010 to 2013 Acura ZDX. In this video I'm going to give you a lot of information such as torque specifications, the tools needed to get the job done, and some tips as we go. Comment below if you have any questions, and as well comment with the year, make, and model if this video did help you. Like, subscribe, and share while you're watching. Tell everybody about me. Let's get going on this repair. I already got started without you. Most of my videos get started real quick like this, and I try not to waste my time, and I'll give you as much info as I can. I'm going to spray some WD-40 on these little screws holding the rotor on. I'm not going to spray too much. I am going to be replacing the rotors on this one, and I always recommend just go ahead and replace them. They're pretty cheap these days, and if you're going to be doing your own brakes to save the money, do it right. So don't spray too much WD-40 on them. It's not really needed, just enough to loosen them up. Get in between the surfaces right there. I'm going to use a impact driver to loosen these screws. There is a special Honda Phillips head that you could use, and I'll put a link in the description to that. But I'm using the general Phillips that comes with the impact driver. When you're using the impact driver, I'm not, with my left hand when I'm turning it, I'm not putting any force. I'm just holding it in the loosened direction, so the counterclockwise direction, and I'm letting the hammer and the impact driver do all the work. So just holding it in the counterclockwise direction, hit it with the hammer, and that'll cause the impact driver to forcefully turn. So you, as the human, don't do much. Use the tools. Let the tools do the work. Just hold that driver in the direction you want to go and hit it with the hammer, and it'll force it to go. You do not use the impact driver to install those screws if you, when you are reassembling. To make it much easier, I'm going to turn the wheel to the passenger side so the brake system or the brake caliper and everything is pointing out. Makes it a lot easier. Now let's take a look at everything, see what we are going to be removing. On the caliper, you're going to have both of your caliper bolts, and then you're going to have two caliper bracket bolts. Going up your brake hose, you're going to have a 12mm bolt right there. First off, your caliper right there, that is being held on with a 17mm bolt head. Again, right there, caliper bolt. Now, the bracket down here holds the caliper assembly to the spindle. This right here is going to be a 19mm. When we are reassembling everything, we're going to make sure we properly tighten everything down to proper torque specifications on the caliper. Right there, that 19mm holding the caliper bracket onto the spindle. This is a pretty easy job. It takes about 45 minutes, an hour on each side. Not long at all. I'm using a 3/8 drive 17mm 6-point socket to loosen these caliper bolts. These ones are pretty tight, and I was really surprised the torque specification, or what the torque specification was on these bolts. I don't think I've ever seen a caliper torque this high. So getting them off, I wasn't really surprised that they were over tightened, because they need to be really tight. So 3/8 drive 17mm. Get both of these caliper bolts removed. Sometimes you can swing the caliper up if you're just going to do a pad slap, and do the pad slap and swing it back down after you compress your caliper. But in this case, get both these loosened up. We're going to remove them. And when I remove my caliper, I like to put the bolt back into the slider, or the bolt back into the hole wherever or whatever I'm working on, just so I don't lose the bolts. For some reason, I'm really good at kicking the bolts around or just losing them when I'm doing these projects. So that's one thing I learned, to be a little bit more organized. Just put the bolts back in the hole, and I'll show you when we get to that point. After we get both of these loosened up to where we can remove them, we want to make sure we get the brake line bolt loosened that's holding the brake line to the strut assembly right here. This is going to be a 12mm bolt head. I like to use 6 points as much as I can. So 6-point socket, 12mm. Just remove that bolt. Again, put it back in the hole when you get the hose off. With this bolt removed and the hose removed, it gives you a little bit more ease of access moving the caliper around when you get the caliper removed. When you do get the caliper removed, you're going to want to set it up on the strut assembly. Just hook it up there like the teeth use the caliper as teeth, so it's not hanging on the hose. But before we get to that, we are going to compress this caliper. And before we even get to that far, after we get everything set up, the caliper compressor set up, we want to make sure we remove the cap on the reservoir. I'm going to show you all that very shortly. You can see I took the caliper bolt off and I put it back in the slider so we don't lose it. Here's the caliper itself. You want to take a look at the boots on the caliper. Make sure when you take your brake pads off, take a picture. Make sure the wear indicator right there is installed in the same location it is as when you removed it. So it might wear in a different fashion, or you might not know that your brakes are going bad if it's not in the right location. So your wear indicator needs to be in the same location when you reinstall it. Again, that's why I like to take plenty of pictures. This is a really cheap caliper compressor. I bought this many moons ago at a local auto parts store. I could have sworn it was like 12 bucks, and this day with inflation and everything is probably like 40 bucks. But I will put some links in the description for a caliper compressor, some like this, and there are some funner, better ones out there, but this one works just fine. You can see there's a tiny little knob on it, but before we compress this piston, we must open the reservoir cap, so when we push the piston into the caliper itself, the fluid has somewhere to go and not through a seal and making more of a mess for you. Just set the cap on the reservoir. If you have a pig pad or something, you might want to put it under the reservoir location on the bottom side of the vehicle. So if anything gets pushed out of the reservoir, easier to clean up in that scenario as well. You want to push the pistons all the way into the caliper as much as possible. The brake pad should be pretty flush with the housing of the caliper itself. You'll see that I pushed down this one on the far side, or the right side, whatever you want to say. And after I get that one pressed all the way down, I'm going to back the compressor out and move it on over to the other side. Just make sure both these pistons are pushed in as far as possible. Again, this little cheap one did the job just fine. Doesn't take much oomph. And really, this job is pretty darn easy. If you have the tools, the patience, torque, wrench and all that, you should get this job done pretty darn easy in your driveway. I'm going to set the caliper up on that strut assembly. I usually use a bungee cord, but that one seems pretty sturdy. It didn't feel like it was going to fall off or anything, so I just set it up there, and it really didn't have any problems. I'm going to use a 1/2-inch breaker bar on a 19 millimeter, or with a 19 millimeter 6-point socket, 1/2-inch breaker bar, to loosen up these bolts holding the caliper bracket onto the spindle. Loosen them up, remove the caliper bracket, and I'm going to put the bolts back into the bracket just so I don't lose them. Don't kick them anywhere. These ones I really wouldn't worry about damaging, but the other smaller bolts, you might damage them if you get them under the jack or something like that. So just, it makes it easier if you know where they're at all the time. We are going to end up replacing the shims on the side of the bracket and re-lubing everything. So set that off to the side for just a moment. Let's get the rotor replaced. Grab a Phillips head screwdriver or your impact driver with the Phillips head on it, and going to remove these screws all the way. They should be really easy since you loosened them up a long time ago using the hammer and all. We just had them on there so that the rotor wouldn't wobble around, and it makes it much easier to disassemble everything. Trust me. If you didn't have these screws, you should have put on a lug nut, the furthest lug from the caliper, and it holds everything in place, makes it much easier. Now, if your rotor is stuck on there, if you're going to reuse your rotor, you can use these 8 millimeter by 125 threads, bolts that is, to press your rotor off of your hub. And in this case, I didn't really need it. It was more for show so you could see that these can be used. And I really just hit these with a hammer, just whack them a few times and they'll come right off. And that's because I replace the rotors pretty often when I do my brake jobs. If your hub looks pretty dirty right here before you install this rotor, take some time, get a wire brush and just rub it off. Make sure your hub is pretty clean when you put your rotor on. I've never really had a problem, so it's something I overlook quite often. So do better than me and double check that. I'm going to use the impact driver to install the screws to hold the rotor on. Again, these I call production screws. I am not going to use the hammer to whack these tight. I'm just going to get these hand tight. When it's nice and snug, I'm going to move on. Now, if you didn't have these screws to hold the rotor in place so it doesn't wobble all around and make everything harder to reassemble, I'm going to use a rotor. A rotor? That's not a rotor. That's a lug nut. I'm going to use a lug nut to hold the rotor in place. That's the furthest lug from the caliper. And I find that's the best one to use if you don't have these production screws. Whenever you buy a brake pad kit, make sure it comes with a hardware kit. You always want to replace these side shims or silencers, whatever you want to call them. But the hardware on your caliper bracket, you always want to replace anytime you take these apart. Before we get to that, we're going to put new grease in the boots on the caliper itself. Make sure you clean all the old grease out if you can, if there's a bunch of built up stuff in there. When you remove the slider, wipe it off real good with a cleaner cloth. Maybe if you have some brake clean, go ahead and use that if you need to. These ones look pretty clean. The grease wasn't too bad, so I wiped everything off. And when I used that flathead screwdriver, what I did was tuck some grease up into the side, like the bellow, the sides of the bellow, so they keep some grease inside there. So over time, when it goes in and out, that it re-lubricates everything. If there is anything or any excess grease that comes out when I put it all back together, make sure everything is wiped off. You don't want any excess grease falling out onto the rotor or onto the brake system later on when someone's on the freeway and they're needing the brakes the most. So if there's any excess grease after you're making sure it's moving in and out like this, wipe it off. And in my opinion, you can't ever have too much grease in the situation. I've done plenty of BJs and I've never ran into a situation, as long as I'm using the right grease, I can't over grease it. If I'm wiping it off, I'm making sure that piston goes all the way in, not the piston, but the slider goes all the way into the caliper, and wipe that grease off, you're not going to have any problems. So be pretty liberal with the grease. You can see stuffing it up in that bellow again. Not too much, it's not pouring out everywhere, just being pretty liberal with it. I like to use this synthetic brake grease right here. Manufacturers, I'm not sure if they have their own that they recommend, but this one seems to work pretty good. I've never had any problems. Been using it for about 4 years, maybe a little bit longer. There will be a link in the description below to purchase that if you need one. And if you do purchase any of the parts with the links in the descriptions, that helps me out too. So buy and click, okay? Please do. If this video does help you out, make sure you comment below with the year, make, model of the vehicle. When you're putting these sliders in, make sure everything goes freely. If anything feels like there's any restrictions, take it apart, clean it up, double check everything. Everything wants to move freely in the brake system. If there's any hampering anywhere, replace it. Now these side shims, silencers, they come by different few names. The hardware, replace both of these. Make sure that they're clipping into place. If there's anywhere where on the inside of the caliper bracket might be rubbing on the rotor, use a flathead. When you assemble it, just make sure that you have that space right there. You don't want these to cause a problem and rub on the rotor. Like, what in the world is going on? What's making that sound? And it's just this, for some reason, didn't clip into place properly and it's rubbing on the rotor when you're not hitting the brakes. Hardware kit is a must whenever you buy a brake pad kit. Trust me. When you do your brakes, or how often do you need to do your brakes? I'd say a factory brake pad will probably last you, or a factory brake job will probably last you around 80K, and then every thereafter brake job should last you about 60 to 80K. I don't know why aftermarket pads don't last as long, but they do. Installing everything, we're going to use torque wrenches to properly torque everything down. This caliper bracket bolt is going to be a 19 millimeter 6-point on a 1/2-inch torque wrench down to 101 foot-pounds. Again, that's 101 foot-pounds for the caliper bracket to the spindle, 101 foot-pounds. Now these brake pads, if you didn't remember, hopefully you took a picture. The wear indicator was on the inside, top side pad, so it's installed in the same location. The brake pads are easily going on, sliding into place. And if you remember, when we took these brakes apart, these brakes did not have these little springs, or these brake pads didn't have these springs on them. So this hardware kit, let me know, something's missing here. These springs will actually push the pads off of the rotor when you're not pressing on the brake pad and the caliper is compressing. So when the caliper, it doesn't really retract, it just doesn't put pressure on. So when the caliper isn't putting pressure on, those little springs on the top and bottom of the pad will help push the pad off of the rotor. Loosen up or remove that top bolt on the slider. We had those on so we didn't lose them. And just put the top one on your caliper. Gonna let it pivot. You're gonna pivot it into place over the pads. When you do pivot it down, make sure the caliper itself doesn't knock the silencing shims off of the back of the actual brake pad, so be careful. You should have plenty of room though if your caliper is completely compressed. Tighten these up finger tight. We're going to grab a 3/8 torque wrench and a 6.17 millimeter socket. We're going to tighten these caliper bolts down to 53 foot-pounds. 53 foot-pounds is pretty tight. I'm used to about 20 to 30 foot-pounds on these caliper bolts. I was very surprised to read 53 foot-pounds. I checked a few sources just to make sure that was the proper torque specification as well. This bolt right here that holds the brake hose on to the strut assembly, I don't ever really torque these ones down. The last time I checked the torque specification on one of these, it was somewhere around 12 foot-pounds, I believe. If you do know it, make sure you comment below, let everybody know. But I usually just get it to good German torque specs of good and tight, and I've never really had a problem. Just make sure it's nice and tight. I'll see if I can find the torque spec, and I'll put it in the description below if I can find it. I probably can, so make sure you check there. Now make sure you pump the brakes. Before you do anything else, before you check the fluid in the reservoir, pump the brakes. Get a nice firm brake pedal right here. It should take 3 to 5 pumps. You don't need to bleed anything out. Just pump the brakes and you're good. Now make sure the level is nice in the reservoir. Put the cap on, make sure it's nice and tight, and your brake job is pretty much done. Go ahead and look at the brakes, admire everything. Before you put the tire on, turn the wheel back into the straight position so it's easier to put the wheel on. I had it turned to the other side so I could just admire it. If you were to do a brake job like this, you're gonna save yourself a couple $100 from doing it at a shop. This brake job costs the parts at a local shop. We're about 300, so 300 bucks to do it. If you buy the parts like on such as Rock Auto or links in the description below for a set from a local store, you'll probably end up paying around 150 bucks for a premium set, about 260 plus shipping. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, make sure you comment below, like, subscribe, and share. Tell everybody about me. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you guys on the next hopefully helpful video. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies.